Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. With me today on Writers at Work is Andy Kroll, a reporter for ProPublica, the nonprofit newsroom that investigates abuses of power. Based in Washington, Andy covers justice and the rule of law. Earlier this year, he won the coveted George Polk Award for political reporting for The Shadow President, a fascinating and comprehensive article about Russ Vought, a conservative, self-described Christian nationalist and longtime Washington bureaucrat who leads the Office of Management and Budget in the current Trump administration. The OMB is the largest and arguably most powerful office in the executive branch. Under Vought, it's responsible for most of the deep cuts in government agencies and services that have occurred since January 2024. Co-published with The New Yorker, you can find The Shadow President on ProPublica's and The New Yorker's websites. A veteran political reporter whose writing appeared in Mother Jones, The New York Times, The Atlantic, and Rolling Stone, Andy is also the author of A Death on W Street, The Murder of Seth Rich, and The Age of Conspiracy. You may recall that in 2016, Rich, a young employee of the Democratic National Committee, was murdered in Washington, D.C., shot in the back by an unknown assailant. Soon, however, the Republican-aligned disinformation machine, with the aid of Fox News and other media outlets and Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, seized the unsolved murder and spun it into a conspiracy theory involving Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Party, much to the dismay of the Rich family. In his book, Andy revealed how the insidious conspiracy campaign came to be and how it eventually unraveled, though not before too many Americans believed it to be true. There's much to talk about with Andy, who I must tell you I've known socially for a good while now. But I want to focus on the writing of The Shadow President and A Death on W Street. Andy Kroll, welcome to Writers at Work.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Andy, I'd like to talk to you about how information you've gathered in your reporting becomes a story for readers. Can we talk about A Death on W Street?
Happily.
When did you first become intrigued by Seth Rich's murder?
If I had to peg it to a specific moment, which I write about in the book, it would be this moment when I was sitting at my desk in about the fall of 2016, a particularly turbulent moment in American politics for anyone who cares to remember it. And I had this surreal out-of-body experience where this guy that I knew on a personal level, social level, started trending, going viral, whatever term you want to use, on social media, on what specifically was then called Twitter. And I had this kind of blank expression on my face. I had this feeling of shock and kind of tingles where these two worlds of mine, the sort of, your personal life, your life outside of work and my work as a reporter, collided in the most spectacular and bizarre way possible. And I, from that moment on, started pursuing the story that ended up becoming my first book, A Death on W Street.
Yeah. When you started to pursue the story, did you accept the police's version that it was a robbery gone wrong? Or did you give any credence whatsoever to the rumors that his murder was somehow connected for his work for the DNC?
I mean, as a journalist, I think you always have to leave some part of your mind open to alternate possibilities. I did a lot of reporting right away. I talked to a lot of former cops, current cops, detectives, federal prosecutors, all manner of law enforcement folks who explained to me why this idea, that this theory of a robbery gone wrong was actually both very plausible and depressingly common in a big city like Washington, D.C. But no, you always leave open a little bit of space in your mind and in your reporting for some other theory. And I spent many years trying to either find some bit of evidence for that or to rule it out, which I think I pretty much did in the reporting process. But no, I think if you close off avenues of inquiry from the beginning, I don't think you're doing your job in the way that you should. And I try to remember to do that with anything that I'm reporting on, whether it's a book, whether it's a story, podcast, you name it.
Yeah. So for someone like myself outside the Beltway, um, there seemed to be uh, powerful forces were pushing the conspiracy as it moved from fringe sites and social media to programs like Sean Hannity's and Tucker Carlson's on Fox News. And then WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange implied that Seth Rich was involved in the leak of some 20,000 documents that were damaging to Hillary Clinton. Um, I think we felt overwhelmed with this tsunami of disinformation. Trump's family members, at least one family member, pushed these rumors. Uh, at some point, did you react to that? And was your reaction something as simple as, I've got to do something about this?
I think it was on a certain level. I think the reaction that came before I've got to do something about this is maybe the most fundamental reaction a writer or a journalist can have, which is why the heck is this happening? What is behind
Hmm.
this? What is driving this? I mean, again, to sort of set the stage, you have this guy who's a bright, hardworking, but by no means senior level leadership C-suite style employee for the Democratic Party in 2016, this infamously turbulent campaign, who is killed, and immediately the media industrial complex, the conspiracy theory vortex on one side of the political aisle revs into gear, mobilizes in a way that I had seen before, but I had never seen in quite this fashion. And of course, I had never seen it in that, suck in someone that I knew, that I had this personal connection with. I mean, it's honestly rare living in Washington, writing about politics, to have that really strong personal tie to a story in the way that I did with this one. Again, I had known Seth, traveled in similar circles as him, friends in common. We even played on the same aggressively mediocre rec soccer team that convenes on the weekends. And so I knew this guy. And then to see him become the object of fixation for, as you listed off, members of the Trump family, Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, Fox News, the whole apparatus mobilizing to push this falsehood about Seth, this person that I knew. That,
So,
the question was just, why is this happening? And then once I started to wrap my head around that, then it became, what can I do about this? What can I, as a journalist, do with the tools that I have, the skills that I have, the sources that I know to try to illuminate what's really going on here?
so you were the Washington bureau chief of Rolling Stone at the time, yes?
That's right. Yep.
So how did you proceed? How did you kick up the idea to your editors, and when did you get the green light? And so how did that unfold?
There were a lot of conversations in 2016 that didn't immediately lead to stories, to reporting. It was more me wrapping my head around the fact that this was happening and talking to my editors about it. Everyone immediately saw the importance of the story, and they were on top of that intrigued to know that I had this personal connection to this story. But I don't think the urgency of it, the magnitude of it, fully came into relief until about 8 months later, when in the spring of 2017, Trump is in office. His administration, as some people will remember, is completely mired in controversy about Russia and about the FBI, Jim Comey, and so on. And then in the midst of all that, Fox News blasts out in the most provocative, misleading way possible this conspiracy theory about Seth, that he was this Edward Snowden like leaker during the 2016 campaign. He was the one behind all of the emails that were leaked during the campaign, and not, foreign intelligence agency, as has been shown to be the case. Once Fox really seizes on this story, then everyone involved, my editors at Rolling Stone, my colleagues, other people in journalism here, were like, "Oh, this is a story. This is a huge story. This will be one of the defining stories of this political moment of the first Trump administration." And you, Andy, should go do it because you've been following it obsessively and you have this connection to it. And so that's what I did.
Yeah. As I read your reporting in Rolling Stone and in A Death on W Street, I had the sense that every day or week brought a new lead about someone unfamiliar to the public who was instrumental in promoting these falsehoods. That must have been dizzying for you.
Yeah, that's probably a mild way to put it. It was disorienting. It was overwhelming because, as you are correct to point out, it seemed like at any one time some new wannabe media impresario, Trump lackey, America First branded podcast was popping up like a game of whack-a-mole. And I was running around both trying to gather up what they said, preserve it so that I had a record of it. Everything in the internet is so liquid, and people delete stuff when they face scrutiny for it. And so I'm trying to capture things. I'm trying to debunk them. And I'm also trying to knit them into this larger story. What in the end ended up being so fascinating was that I sort of was able to highlight in the book each of the kind of archetypes of the sort of conspiracy theorist peddler in the age of social media, in the age of Donald Trump. You have the sort of Trump loyalists. You have the kind of grifter types who are trying to sell something, t-shirts or hats or subscriptions or whatever. And then you had the sort of media insider who are closer to Fox News or Newsmax, the sort of conservative TV networks. And I had a character in the book who sort of stood in for each one of those in a way that both kept you moving in the story, but also opened up this whole world that I don't think a lot of people know exists, but is actually really instrumental in understanding why our democracy seems so messed up right now, why our media information system seems so clogged up right now. So the book was a really, ended up being a really helpful vehicle for laying that out.
Yeah. So your métier is reporting in print. So you're going to have to write at some point. Um, and again, there's the dizzying experience of all these new characters coming in and all these activities that they're undertaking. Um, when did you have a narrative fixed in your
Mm.
mind?
I needed about a year and a half of reporting, day to day in the thick of it, gathering information, preserving it, interviewing people, and then ultimately building out a really detailed chronology to be able to see the narrative, to see who the characters were, to make connections that I hadn't realized were there in terms of something happens on this day, and it triggers something on the next day. Someone is pushing this behind the scenes, and all of a sudden it's on the airwaves of Fox News. I really need timelines to to organize huge troves of reporting. If I don't, I get kind of lost in the swirl of it. But once I had that timeline, and then I could overlay on top of that the experience of Seth Rich's family as they see what's happening, as they come to grips with the way Seth has been sucked into this vortex of misinformation and lies, and then their decision to fight back first in the court of public opinion and then really in the court of law. That's when I saw this narrative. I could braid together the family, Fox News, the conspiracy theorists. Then I really saw this thing come together. I mean, that's when I realized this isn't just a magazine article for Rolling Stone. There's a book in this that has three acts, that has an arc, that has dramatic moments and twists and turns.
Yeah, you faced a problem that writers of reportage, but also novelists face, in that you had a large number of villains, but you had very few heroes until the rich family becomes involved in the story.
The weird experience there was that I had that exact realization at some point, maybe in a conversation with my book agent or a fellow writer, and I almost had to sort of wait for things to play out and see what the family would do and who would help them take up this case, who would take up their cause, really, to have those sympathetic characters. Because the family obviously are very sympathetic. You feel for them, you are taken on this journey with them, but a lot of the time they are having things done to them. They are watching these lies said about Seth, and ultimately about them personally, because the conspiracy theories sort of metastasize to pull them in as well, the family members. And it isn't until they take their grievance to the court of law and they have some pretty tenacious lawyers who come along and take the cases and take on Fox News that we had those good guys, for lack of a better way to
Right,
put it. But it
right.
was a weird thing to kind of wrap my head around. I'm an investigative journalist by trade, and I'm sort of used to writing about bad actors harming people out in the world. But in this case, it's like, no, you need someone to root for. You need someone who is fighting the good fight in this larger sort of messed up world.
Yeah. What was your first draft like?
The first draft was, as first drafts so often are, too long. And I mean, the one big thing I remember about it was I did not, I hadn't wrapped my arms around how to weave together the different characters, the different plot lines, storylines in a way that would move the story forward, that would keep the pace going, but also keep all these different characters, you know, these different balls in the air at one time. And I actually, I went back and I watched television, good dramatic television, to see, like, when do you leave this character and pick the next one up? And then when do you leave them and pick the next one up? And then when do you come back and how do you braid these different plot lines together? I mean, there are books, obviously, many, many great nonfiction, fiction books that do this well, but for whatever reason, television helped me think about that. I remember watching The Americans, which is one of my favorite shows, with Matthew Rhys and Kerry Russell, with a notepad in my hand, and I would just make little notations about, is this the scene with, what's it, Beeman, the FBI agent? And then we cut back to Matthew Rhys, and and seeing how they did it in the space of a television episode, and then that kind of informing how I would do it chapter by chapter.
You talked about a three-act structure earlier. Um, the, we're reminded that a book isn't a very, very long article,
No,
right? You could write an article that's as long as a book, and it wouldn't be a book,
right.
right? And I think TV is high quality TV is about concise storytelling. And I do remember that A Death on W Street moved very quickly, even though you were introducing these wacky figures. And what you succeeded in was that they were, in many ways, they were cartoonish, but you somehow got across that they were people.
Well,
Yeah.
there was a challenge. I remember talking to my editor early on, in that these are wacky characters. They are cartoonish characters, and you do want to laugh them off, brush them off as minor fringe players. But the thing that makes the social media era so unique is a trademark of this media era is that someone who can seem like a buffoon, who seems like they are purely at the margins, can still reach a huge amount of people, can still change the perception, change stories, can challenge official narratives, whatever, and can have a real impact on people's lives, whether it's what they believe or if you're the rich family, what others are saying and believing about your son. And so we had to balance that. And we had to, and again, that gets back to this notion of these characters had to stand for something larger. They had to be a proxy for,
Mm.
the sort of fringy dude that no one would take seriously, who back in the pre-internet era would just be sitting at the end of the bar spouting conspiracy theories to four people and they wouldn't go anywhere other than that.
Right.
With Twitter, with Facebook, with YouTube, that same guy can reach 1 million people in 5 minutes if he crafts the right content, has that conspiracy theory that is just so tantalizing that we really wanted to capture and channel through those characters.
Yeah. I felt, I mentioned this to you, I think, at some point, that a death on W Street profited from your outrage.
Hmm.
I felt that at a certain point, the events were so clearly and indisputably manipulated that a rational person could no longer contain his emotions. So I wouldn't say you snapped, but you had to choose a side. Is that a fair way to put it?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that is a fair way to put it. I didn't choose the side before I did the legwork of sifting
Correct.
fact from fiction. But once I had done that work, yeah, I mean the righteous indignation was burning just below the surface. I mean, hopefully it wasn't spilling out because then I think you seem like you've lost control of your voice as a writer or you're too biased in one direction. But yeah, I mean, once I had done the work and run this thing to ground in a way that no one else had and ever will, frankly. Yeah, I felt that there was both something kind of liberating, but also there was a fuel to that. That I was, this sounds self-righteous, but that I had to be the person who would be fighting for the work of correcting the record and clearing this guy's name and telling the world, like, you may think you know what happened here. You may have seen something online, but I am going to tell you what the real story is here. And I still feel that way. I still bump into people who either jokingly or, semi-seriously are like, "Oh yeah, I mean, that's a rich guy. Like he got whacked by the Clintons or the Russians, right?" And the righteous indignation in those situations does not stay below the surface. It actually does come pouring out in a controlled way, of course. But
Yeah.
yes, there is that energy pulsing underneath the story, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, I also think that someone, or hopefully more than someone, uh, is willing to say, there is a difference between fact and fantasy here.
Hmm.
These people. I mean, you, I think, prove conclusively that people at Fox knew the story was false and went with it, and that there were people on the fringe who, as you mentioned, now can reach millions who were saying things that just never happened.
Yeah.
And so here comes a book that says, this is what happened. And here's how I can show you how I know it happened.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a first person character in the book in a serious way, a little bit in the beginning, a little bit at the end, but you can read the book as a journalist and again, someone with a personal connection to the story, wading through the muck, sifting fact from fantasy and holding to account exposing and holding to account the people who promoted and profited from these fictions about Seth, and that's how I felt about this project. I mean, it was, I we used to write these magazine stories and get emails from agents or book editors or whatever, and say like, you should do a book about that. And I said, I think I've said everything I want to say. I don't really know where this would go from here. And someone gave me great advice, which was, when a book idea comes along, you will know it because you'll have either written a long story and want to just keep going, or you will have an idea that you just cannot shake, that you cannot get out of your mind. It haunts your dreams when you go to sleep at night, and when you wake up, you're thinking about it. And that was this book. I mean, I just had to do it. I would have done it any way I possibly could have. I mean, thankfully, good publisher and all that. But this was one where I thought, oh, this is what that feeling is, where I have to do this book. I feel compelled to do this, and there is no question, there's no doubt that I'm going to.
Let's talk about the shadow president. You tell a very complicated story about a man few of us knew anything about, and yet had enormous influence on our lives. How did this story come about? What intrigued you?
Yeah, the fellow we're talking about is Russell Vought. He has kicked around Washington, D.C. in one capacity or another for 20 years, 25 years. And he had been on the periphery of my radar, if you will, almost since the time I moved to Washington in the heyday of the Tea Party going back to 2010 or so. But never was the guy, never was the Steve Bannon or the Rahm Emanuel, or pick your sort of brash, brawling operative du jour in American politics. But about August, September of 2024, during the presidential campaign, I got my hands on this tape, this recording of a speech that Russ Vought had given behind closed doors to a bunch of his friends and allies in the conservative movement, specifically in the Trump MAGA movement, of which Vought is a leading figure now. And I watched this video, and I love these kinds of reporting gets because, one, you have the tape. They can't argue with you about whether they said something or did something or not, because you have the goods, you have the receipts. And there was this line that Russ Vought had about halfway through this speech he gave in this tape I'm watching. Vought says that he wants to intentionally traumatize the career civil employees of the federal government with the policies of a second Trump administration, if Trump were to get reelected in 2024. We want to put them in trauma, is what Russ Vought said. Now, I'd been kicking around, again, as I said, Washington for 15 years at that point. And I listened to this tape and I said, I've never heard someone, Democrat, Republican, left, right, whatever, so explicitly say that the goal of our policies, our agenda, that their mission is to traumatize the humble civil servants of the American government. And so we wrote a story about that, obviously. Have to report that someone very close to Donald Trump has this explicit agenda to put civil servants through hell if Trump is president. But it also set these gears moving in my head toward this question of who explicitly says that they want to traumatize someone else. Where does this come from? Like I knew who he is, but then I ask anew, who is this guy? Why would you want to do this? And that is what set in motion this process, almost a year of writing what I think is, the most revealing, comprehensive story about someone who I would argue is one of the two or three most important figures in the entire Trump administration today.
And one reaction I had when I read the article was, why didn't I know about the kind of power the head of the
Hmm.
Office of Management Budget can yield? As you wrote, the OMB reviews all significant regulations proposed by individual agencies. It vets executive orders before the president signs them. It issues workforce orders for more than 2 million federal employees. Every penny appropriated by Congress is dispensed by the OMB. Later in the piece, you state, Vote is the architect of Trump's broader plan to fire civil servants, freeze government programs, and dismantle entire agencies. And I consider myself to be at least moderately well informed, and I never heard of the guy.
It's what I like to think the citizens of New York City, certain pockets of New York City, might have thought when highways were built through their neighborhoods were bulldozed and highways were built, and then someone eventually came along and said, "Yeah, a guy named Robert Moses did this."
Yeah.
It's like, Robert Moses, who? Like he works at the Parks Service? What? This doesn't make any sense. Vote is, in a strange way, a kind of dark mirror image of Moses in that he's someone who intentionally flies under the radar. He seeks power and knows how to wield it and has studied power and methodically proceeded in a way to accumulate it and use it in a massive way, and has done it without ever getting elected to anything. The Office of Management and Budget is this little known, hugely important corner of the federal government. It's sort of like the tiny little part of the government that everything flows through, the little piece of the hose that if you were to put a kink in it, as Russ Vought does, you could basically bring the government to a standstill. You wouldn't think there's any one place in the vast American government you could do that, but in fact there is, and it's the OMB. And Russ Vought understands that in a way that few other people do. And a lot of the turbulence and the downsizing, the firing of federal workers, the closing of agencies like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, USAID, the demolition of those agencies. So much of that traces back to Russ Vought. And I wanted to write about him because I saw these power plays coming together. And I also think I just have an attraction to stories where the central character is not someone that everyone already knows about, but that they should. And I'm going to take you on a little journey to help you understand why you should care about this person. I don't want to write another Donald Trump profile or another piece about Stephen Miller, though I think that he is evidently massively influential. Another Steve Bannon story. I want to write about the guy who wields power in an effective, massive way that you haven't heard of, but who is changing the world in ways that you do see.
It's uncanny that you mentioned Robert Moses because I have in my notes here something Francis Perkins said about Robert Moses.
Mm.
Uh, he loves the public, but he hates people. And at
It's a great
times,
line.
yeah, Vote seems to act in direct opposition to what he claims is his belief system. For example, he claims to be a Christian, but you quote him as having dismissed the number of deaths that could be caused by shutting down
Hmm.
the U.S. Agency for International Development, better known as USAID. He says you could say that about any of the cuts he was proposing. And one of your sources said of him, there's compassion, but it extends only to certain people. Trump portrayed Vote as you point out, the Grim Reaper of Washington. But
Yes.
you can't really depict him as a cartoonish figure. Um, how did you given that Vote wouldn't talk to you and apparently is in a circle wouldn't talk to you on the record? How did you find a way to understand Vote as a person, not merely as a lifelong Washington insider and bureaucrat, but as a fellow human being.
I did something that I think Gay Talese talked about when he maybe did the Frank Sinatra Has a Cold story. I mean, this vote piece, while there are moments like the one you read about the meeting vote dismissing, you know, excess deaths caused by his own decisions, you feel like you're in the room. You're literally in the room. Yeah, he would not be interviewed. And so this piece was in some ways a classic write around. How do I take you inside this guy's head? How do I take you inside the room and help you understand him as a person without being able to sit across from him and say, as I would have, Russ, how do you reconcile your devout Christian faith with your decisions to slash humanitarian assistance in ways that will be lethal to the people who need that aid and where it had gone before? I did what Talise said. I drew these concentric rings, starting with him in the middle, outward, and found people at every layer of the process who could help me piece together what makes this guy tick, his psychology, his family, his faith, how he reconciles the faith with the draconian slash and burn policies. I think that I did a pretty good job of that. I mean, the other benefit I had was this whole story was sparked by the recording of him, in which he talks about wanting to traumatize people. We got a whole bunch more recordings for this story. And so I had him in his own words as well, talking about Christian nationalism, talking about how we need a radical constitutionalist to restore the country to what the founders wanted. And in Donald Trump, we have that radical constitutionalist. That's verbatim, what he says.
Right.
And so I think between having this trove of unguarded footage, or this footage of Vogt speaking in unguarded ways, speaking to his own people, and also just piecing together all of these different accounts of people who knew him, worked with him, worked against him, sat in rooms with him, you start to create this almost pointillist portrait of him and understand, what brings him to this place again, where he says the thing we need to do is traumatize federal workers so they won't get out of bed in the morning, and then we can do what we want to do with the government.
Yeah. Um, I mean, this is a huge story. I mean, and um, I imagine you were in constant contact with your editors. And when did you have a sense of the best way to tell the story?
The I mean, I think we always knew we would open with the scene that we open with in the room where Vogt makes this comment, brushing off one of his top experts saying, if you do this, more people are going to die. And he kind of says, whatever. And that was a funny moment because I had been interviewing someone, and if you're interviewing someone for your project, your writing project, the best advice I can give you is don't talk over them. I think Robert Caro would write in his notebooks, shut up with an exclamation point, because if you leave the space open with someone you're interviewing, they will usually fill it. It may feel a little awkward, but they will usually fill it. And in the case of a source I was interviewing, I was trying to practice what I preach here, and right at the end, this person said, "Oh, well, there maybe is one other thing I should tell you about." I was like, "Oh, yeah, what would that be?" And that is when I started to piece together this particular moment, and that was always going to be the beginning. The story was the draft was a lot longer because there's so much to say about this guy, and with my editor, it was really trying to surgically trim from every different part of the draft that we could, and to make some hard decisions about scenes that I think other people thought were revealing to leave out. I mean, there was one moment in particular in around 2017, Vogt appears before the Senate. He's going up for a confirmation hearing to during the first Trump administration, and there's this clash between him and Senator Bernie Sanders over an op-ed that Vogt had written where he was extremely negative about Muslims and basically saying, they don't respect God and denigrating the entire his entire religion. And there was this clash with Bernie Sanders. And one of my own colleagues said, like, how could you have left that out? How did you make that decision? And when a story is 8,000 words long, that's your target, and you're at 12, you have to make hard decisions. And that was one that we made. And I mean, anything that just felt like it was in the past and not essential and pushing us forward, we just had to lose it. So there were some painful cuts, but when you're at that stage, you know this as well as I do, Jim. Any cut feels kind of painful at that point.
Yeah, one thing I love about the story is that you have to explain so much to us about the inner workings of OMB and the executive branch that I don't you didn't really have the time to go off on tangents.
No.
I mean, you had to do the equivalent of backstory every now and then to just refresh us on how powerful OMB is. If you had used that space to go off to tell like that kind of anecdote about Bernie Sanders defending Muslims, it might have hijacked the direction of the narrative.
Yeah, I think it would have. I think it would have slowed things down to in a way that maybe you lose a reader at that point. I mean, those are the moments when I find it really helpful to have someone read the story who has fresh eyes. Sometimes I'll have another editor read it. Sometimes I'll have my wife read it. Anyone who can just come at this fresh and find those little places where this dragged a little bit, or like why exactly was this needed here? Does this really add that much more? And I think by that point in the story, we'd already kind of established that Vote held these very conservative, very intense, radical, whatever you want to say, views channeled through his Christian faith. Do we need to hit that beat again? Like, probably not, even if that moment is explosive and got a lot of attention at the time.
So, what assumptions did you make about your readers?
Good question.
Let me amplify that, okay?
Yeah.
At one point, you write, in Vogt's vision for the U.S. government, an all-powerful executive branch would be able to fire workers, cancel programs, shutter agencies, and undo regulations that govern air and water quality, financial markets, workplace protection, and civil rights. I can't imagine many ProPublica or New Yorker readers would read that and think, hey, that's a great idea,
No.
right?
No, I don't think you'd find many sympathetic ears there. Um, I mean, I think that sentence in particular, we wanted to be both clear-eyed, but not soft pedal the enormity of what Russ Vought really wants to do. Does Vought himself come out and rattle off a list like that? No, of course not. He's too strategic. He's too canny to say it so plainly. But when you look at the sum total of what he has said he wants to do and what the implications of his agenda are, you get that list. You get just a dramatic reshaping of what the American government is and does. For the readers, I think that we, I wanted to both make plain for them the consequences of what and the impacts of what he wants to do. I think wanted to demystify some of this stuff around the Office of Management and Budget and what this corner of the White House actually does in a way that will stick with people but won't bog them down. I think I reread some pieces of Michael Lewis's book, The Fifth Risk, where I thought he did an amazing job of translating the work of, nuclear safety engineers or whatever at the Department of Energy, risk specialists or whatever other agency, and boiling that down in a way that felt human, that felt relatable, that felt easily, comprehensible, but also didn't treat our readers like they're idiots. They
Right.
follow this stuff, they know. So let's make it smart, but let's make it plain and clear. And I hope that's what we did here.
Well, I think you do very much so, and I think ProPublica and the New Yorker do that quite frequently, as in almost always. And I would say the news pages of the Wall Street Journal do that as well,
Hmm.
in which you demonstrate a respect for the reader.
Yeah.
And what I really appreciated, and it made me think more about long form journalism, is that you lead us to conclusions now and then, usually by quoting a well informed source.
Hmm.
But I had the sense that you were encouraging us to take a breath every now and then and consider the implications of the previous paragraph or several paragraphs. Um, it's not quite a dialogue, but it's a very inviting form of storytelling. Um, I almost feel like a participant in the story.
Mm. I love to hear that. I I think that's a skill or a quality of the writing that sometimes to me feels a bit in tension with investigative reporting, where you're trying to beat people over the head with this is what I found and this is what it means and this is, who's affected by it and this is who's doing the bad things. When the New Yorker was so great because they want all of the meaty reporting. They want the sort of rich descriptions of characters and institutions and so on. But what you're describing really came out in the editing process where there was just a lot of sort of very subtle, not thinning out, but just a very subtle kind of pruning of the draft. And I remember getting one version back when it was still going back and forth in manuscript form before it went into the page proofs, where I said, "Oh, like this is kind of like the New Yorker magic in the editing process, where I feel like it's restrained. It as you wonderfully put it, treats the reader with respect. It it asks you, yeah, to think along with me as we're going, and maybe even poses some questions that are left for you, the reader, to think through as we're proceeding through the story. It doesn't try to ask and answer everything. It kind of invites you in a bit more and leaves you to think about things. And again, that was really in the editing process. And I saved all those drafts because I've gone back and looked at like what did we actually take out on a line by line level that brought that quality into the writing, because I want to hold on to that. I want to like be able to do that from the beginning, and not have someone else do it for me, because I think that's just like such a hallmark of good writing, fiction or nonfiction.
Yeah. I want to say to our listeners here that any attempt that I've made to summarize Andy's reporting is probably insufficient, definitely insufficient. I encourage you to read the article and the published supporting material, as I mentioned in the introduction. You can find them on ProPublica's website and on the New Yorker's website. Andy, you're working on another book now, aren't you?
I am working on another book, a nonfiction book, historical true crime, I think is the way I've been telling people about the book. It charts the rise and fall of the first sort of magnate kingpin of the American adult entertainment industry, the first king of pornography in America, who was not Hugh Hefner or Larry Flint, these sort of celebrity type figures, but a guy who actually built a business empire from the business of corner newsstands all the way up to an international enterprise. Um, the guy's name was Michael Thevis, no longer alive, and it's a story that I the beats of this story, the plot twists, the details, the characters, even just the names of the characters are so memorable and so literary. I mean, it really does feel like something out of one of the great, Southern fiction writer canon type stories. And it's set against this amazing period in time, which is, of course, 60s and in the 70s, sexual liberation, sort of moral policing of the federal government, Hoover, Nixon, and so on, and this massive national debate about what is obscenity, what is deemed too risque for Americans to consume, and should we draw that line, and what does the Supreme Court say? So it has a great sort of meta level to it, and then it has this just unbelievably dramatic narrative through line to it. So I'm by day, I'm writing about new figures in the Trump administration, unearthing things there, and then early in the morning and late at night, I'm reading FBI transcripts and grand jury testimony about murders and car bombings and peep show machines and that whole world. So it's a strange split existence I'm living right now.
My guest is Andy Kroll, a reporter for ProPublica who covers justice and the rule of law. Earlier this year, he won the coveted George Polk Award for political reporting for The Shadow President, a fascinating and comprehensive article about Russ Vought, a longtime Washington bureaucrat who leads the largest and arguably most powerful office in the executive branch. Andy is also the author of A Death on W Street, The Murder of Seth Rich and the Age of Conspiracy, that reveals how disinformation is spread by the current administration and its allies, and its heartbreaking effect on a family grieving for a lost loved one. Andy, thank you so much for joining us on Writers at Work.
I'm a big fan of the podcast, Jim, so it's a real treat to be on with you and to have this discussion.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersatworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.